The most famous and infamous axe murderer in history is Lizzie Andrew Borden. She allegedly axed her father and mother to death in their home on Thursday, August 4th, 1892. However, she was not the first woman to pick up an axe and kill her family. This is the story of the Cumberland Mountain axe murders that took place 48 years before the Borden murders and equally rocked the nation. One of Tennessee's most puzzling unsolved cases involving the O'Neal family in Overton County, Tennessee, on Friday, September 11th, 1846. Almost every source states that the murder took place on Tuesday, September 15th. This is actually not true, as it was the day that Patsy and her conspirators were arrested and started their wait for trial. We will now tell the story of Patsy O'Neal Troxdale and the death of her family. All aboard the Kentucky-Tennessee Living Time Machine. Please fasten your seatbelts and keep your arms and legs inside of the vehicle at all times. But to get going, we need your help. We still need to fire up that time machine to transport us. Please help us by clicking on the like, subscribe, and bell notification buttons down below. Not only does this fire up the time machine for our flight back in time, but it convinces the YouTube algorithm that we need a bigger vehicle to reach more people who love history as much as you do. Now, back to our story. Overton County, Tennessee. First, we will cover the area that the murders took place in. This will become very important as the story unfolds. Overton County, home of the modern-day city of Cookeville, is located on the Cumberland Plateau. The county straddles the eastern highland rim. The beautiful area sits on low, rolling hills that are divided by narrow creek valleys. The county has a total of 435 square miles, of which 433 square miles is land and 1.4 square miles is water, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. In 1846, this area did not have a lot of settlements and was not very densely populated. There were a couple of pioneer settlements, but they were sparsely populated. This would explain why the bodies of the O'Neal family was not discovered quickly and were not removed from the site as soon as they were discovered. The O'Neal family. Now that we have talked about the area that the murders had occurred, let's talk about the family that was involved. Edward O'Neal was a poor Appalachian farmer that owned a small tract of land at the foot of the Cumberland Mountain in Overton County, Tennessee. O'Neal was about 40 years old and made extra money as a day laborer. However, according to accounts, O'Neal loved to drink whiskey and would turn mean-spirited each time he went off on a bender. O'Neal was known to take his irritation, frustration, and violent behavior out on his wife Sarah and his elder daughter Patsy. There was Patsy and Jackson, who was the oldest son and about 12 years old, with 4 other children who are not named in any of the sources, being much younger and weaker. The ages of Patsy runs anywhere between 16 to 20 years old, and she was unmarried at the point in this story. She had a very wild nature and was often seen to accompany men along with drinking and other bad attributes. All of this was a point of contention between Patsy and her father. This is the layout of the O'Neal family home and buildings. The family lived in a small, old, dry cabin built from small, round logs. The floor was made of puncheons with a cellar underneath it that was 2.5 feet wide and 5 to 6 feet long. A short distance from the home was a small shed that served as a kitchen for the family. About 140 to 240 yards from the house was the fodder house. During the month of September 1846, it is said that the family was living in the fodder house. Patsy, it seems, was a handful. She was known to have several lovers all over the county, carried weapons from time to time, and had lewd behavior. At some point, it is said that Patsy moved out to the barn to avoid conflicts with her father. According to the ancestry source, quote, Patsy's intrigues were known to her father. He had threatened to thrash her, and she had threatened to take his life. He had given orders to her that she should not live on the place, and that she must seek her home by Monday, the Monday next succeeding the day on which she was murdered. Unquote. So, it seems that Edward had waited too late to try to reel in his daughter from her wayward path. The events of Friday, September 11th, 1846. Sometime during the day, Nicholas Stevens and William E. Upton paid a visit to the farm. Stevens and Upton were living in Cumberland Mountain, just 7 or 8 miles from the O'Neal farm. They were also poor farmers who were married, but also lewd in their personalities. When they left their home, they told their families that they were going to the O'Neal farm to get their money back from the purchase of a horse. There are some sources that state that the horse was either sickly or it died within a week of purchase from O'Neal. On their journey, they had stopped at a grocery store, which is a euphemism for a place that you can buy bootlegged whiskey or moonshine, which was 3.5 miles from the O'Neal cabin. They bought a half a gallon of whiskey, which they drank part of it, and took the rest of the bottle to the O'Neal farm with them. The two men were looking for Edward O'Neal, but instead came upon his wife, Sarah. She explained that O'Neal was not at home, that they should come back a little later. A source states that the men inquired about who was home, and Sarah told them that Patsy was digging ginseng. The men caught up to her and made arrangements to stay at the barn with her for the night. So, where was Edward O'Neal? For the entire week, it seems that he had taken a job with a neighbor who lived 3 or 4 miles down the road to cut lumber for boards. After work, O'Neal had taken the path through the forest. From here, there are 2 conflicting stories. One story states that he bought some whiskey on his way home and got drunk. In another story, there was nowhere to buy whiskey on his way home, and no witnesses saw him on his journey. O'Neal had a job lined up for Saturday, September 12th, doing similar work for another neighbor. He did not show up for work that morning. Events back at the fodder house that evening were said to happen like this. Upton and Stevens had caught up with Patsy and were in the barn together. On and off during the night, they would leave the barn to see if the residents in the fodder house were asleep yet. Before the dawn broke the next morning, Upton and Stevens left the O'Neal residence. They walked through the woods, drinking the rest of their whiskey. Both were wearing white clothes, and there was no blood spotted on either man. On their way home, they passed through a thick settlement. They told the residents that they had slept out in the woods overnight. They also stated that they had stayed at Upton's elderly uncle's home. Upton would testify that he made these statements to prevent their wives from finding out that they had been spending time with Patsy. The events of Saturday, September 12th, and Sunday, September 13th. Sometime during the evening hours of September 12th, the O'Neal's family home caught on fire. By the morning of Sunday, September 13th, the cabin had been reduced to ashes. Warning: this next section of the story is very graphic in nature and is read directly from the article from the Tennessean. Viewer discretion is advised. If you wish to skip this section of how the destruction of the house and how the bodies were found, please skip to the next timestamp. The following is from the January 31st, 1849, the Tennessean. Quote, on Sunday morning, the blank day of September 1846, Patsy Troxdale, then Patsy O'Neal, returned to her father's house. After spending the preceding night at a neighbor's, a Mrs. Householder, who accompanied her home, they found the small cabin in which the O'Neal family lived nearly reduced to ashes, and after looking into the building ruins, they could discover several dead bodies heaped together in a small hole or cellar underneath the floor. Patsy thought she recognized the bodies laying on top as those of her father and mother. Several of the neighbors assembled during the day, but no effort to remove the bodies was made until the next day, when a jury of inquest was assembled by the coroner of the county, and the proceedings taken to investigate the transaction. The bodies were dug out of the ruins and were found to be 7 in number and were identified as the bodies of Edward O'Neal and his wife and their 5 children, ranging from the age of 14 or 15 down to a child of only 2 years old. Patsy Troxdale was the only survivor of the family. The bodies were all badly burned, with the exception of those 2 youngest children, which lay at the bottom of the pit. The heads and extremities of the old man and his wife were burned off, and those of the children, except as above, were so injured by the fire as to destroy entirely their natural appearance. No marks of violence could be discovered on the parts remaining, except in the case of the 2 youngest children, whose heads seemed to have been crushed in places as if with an axe. Skippers, or maggots the size of a grain of wheat, were found in the body of the youngest child. An axe was discovered sticking in the stump of a tree, with spots of blood on the handle, and on the wood where it went through the eye of the axe. Some of the few hairs, like those of a child, were noticed by some of the witnesses adhering to this instrument." Unquote. Questions about the crime scene. We understand that this was a very graphic description of the crime scene, and there are many who have skipped it and now are rejoining us. But we have to wonder how long the bodies were in the pit for the youngest child to have maggots already. And we have to ask, where are the heads of the parents? Were they in the pit? Were they turned to ash? Or were they somewhere else? While these questions won't be answered, it is something that could have been important to the case. As it was, the job will be a little harder to find out who actually did the crime. The placement of the bodies was also a little odd. Why were the children placed at the bottom of the cellar and not the parents? Could they have been placed in order of their death? But this would not make sense, as the hair of the child was found on the axe. Or was there a reason why Edward and Sarah were placed last? There are other questions which we cannot have answers to, but the placement does speak to the mindset of the person who was responsible. In our next video, we will be going into the questioning of Patsy O'Neal Troxdale and her co-conspirators. We will hear their stories change as the accusation of murder looms ahead. Will Troxdale, Stevens, and Upton be found guilty of the crime? And what punishment, if any, will they receive for these acts of violence? Thank you. Kentucky, Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the myths and the legends of the Appalachian Mountains. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell notification button. Please be sure to double check that you are subscribed, as some of our viewers are finding that they are no longer subscribed to our channel. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky, Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries in Appalachian history.